On a frosty winter morning in March 1915, thousands of shivering troops, cold, tired, but determined, lined up in trenches across these fields, waiting for the signal to advance. When it came, with the blast of an officer's whistle, they would rise as one and storm the heavily defended German positions opposite. Over the next 3 days, a brutal fight would unfold, which would see thousands of men, on all sides, fall dead and wounded across this landscape. But just why did that attack take place? What happened to those in the advance, and how did the Indian Corps manage to show such determination in leading that fight? In this video, with aerial and on-the-ground footage, historic imagery and the words of those who were there, we'll follow in the footsteps of those who fought in the Battle of Neuve Chapelle. By the spring of 1915, the Western Front had developed into a system of trenches and fortifications that stretched from the English Channel right down to the border of Switzerland. After the Germans invaded France and Belgium in August the previous year in what was known as the Schlieffen Plan, the British deployed a small expeditionary force of 2 corps, around 100,000 men, which was to fight on the left flank of the much larger French army. They quickly deployed to France and met the German First Army head-on, fighting a delaying action at Mons, making an astonishing fighting withdrawal through Le Cateau before joining up with the French Sixth Army to fight north of Paris at the Battle of the Marne in early September. This fight turned the tide, and what followed was a series of actions where both sides tried to outflank each other as they raced to the English Channel. Having exhausted those efforts and run out of space by November, the Western Front settled into the stalemate that we associate with trench warfare. But Britain had not joined the fight alone. Standing side by side were men and women from across the Empire, foremost amongst them troops of the Indian Army. In early 1915, the Indian Corps, as it was then, formed a key part of the British Expeditionary Force in the field, which had slowly swelled to 2 armies. It was a harsh winter for both sides in the newly constructed defensive lines, but the Germans now firmly occupied most of Belgium and huge swathes of France. The main objective was to evict the invaders, and as part of the first coalition attempt to push them back, the British contribution would be in the flat, wet plains of French Flanders. Enter Neuve Chapelle. Neuve Chapelle, a small straggling village not far from the French-Belgian border, is situated roughly midway between the well-known Western Front towns of Ypres and Arras, and opposite the crucial and then German-occupied French industrial city of Lille, the capture of which at the start of the war had severely restricted French war production and enraged its population. As such, the desire to drive the occupiers from that city meant that throughout 1915 a number of attacks would take place in this flat agricultural region. The first of those was to be a joint operation with the French army, who would attack further south in Artois with the aim of pushing the Germans 20 kilometers back to and possibly beyond Lille. Capturing the city would also potentially split German forces in Belgium from those in France and allow the Allies to exploit a breakout. We must recognise though that other things were afoot in March 1915. Britain and France were diverting divisions to prepare for the ill-fated Gallipoli campaign, and because of the failure of the German Schlieffen Plan to crush the French in 6 weeks, the Germans themselves were compelled to reinforce the Eastern Front to fight the huge advances being made by Russians. This created a possible opportunity for an advance to be made right here. In the lead up to the battle, the British occupied a line running from Ypres to La Bassée, but the French were extremely stretched, holding the bulk of the Western Front and heavily engaged in the Champagne sector, so ultimately had to withdraw their support for the coming offensive due to lack of manpower. So, this would become the first independent offensive operation for the British Army under the command of General Sir Douglas Haig, and although capturing Lille was now off the table, the plan for the British was to break into the German lines at Neuve Chapelle, drive through to the gently rising slopes of the Orbers Ridge, and then assess the possibility of exploiting beyond. After their losses in the fighting through 1914, British regular divisions were now a shadow of those deployed to France, and the territorial force, effectively part-time reserve battalions, were starting to arrive on the Western Front. But the massive Kitchener's new army of volunteers were yet to fight. In short, the British were low on infantry reserves, experience and firepower. Let's descend onto the battlefield and get a feel for the lie of the ground to be assaulted. By far the best way to understand where exactly those trenches ran and what the battlefields looked like at the time is to use a trench map. Thanks to our friends at Great War Digital, that's exactly what we've done here. In total, thousands of variations of trench maps were created throughout the Great War by all sides, meticulously planning the front lines in detail. By using a trench map just like this one of Neuve Chapelle from the Great War Digital Archive, we can accurately plot those locations on today's ground. In fact, for anyone ever visiting a battlefield, a tool that can do that for you is essential. For that purpose, Great War Digital have created Linesman, containing over 800 trench maps. It's available on PC or Mac for at-home research like ours in this video, or as Linesman to go for use on a tablet or smartphone to be used on the ground. I use mine literally every time I'm on the battlefields. The beauty is that it's GPS located, and so you can place your exact position on the historic trench map and walk the old front lines, accurate to the meter. You can even change maps according to date to see how the lines moved, and the map automatically updates as you go. So if you'd like to know more about Linesman and what a fantastic tool it is for historians, be sure to check it out in the link below. The first impression to take is that when compared to future battles in the First World War, the area in which the fighting would take place is relatively compact. Overlaying this remarkable early aerial reconnaissance photograph, which helped generate some of the first trench maps, and superimposing that trench map to understand the lines as they ran at the time, we find that the distance between the moated Grange Farm in the north and the position known as Port Arthur Salient in the south is no more than 2,000 metres. On the axis of attack, the village of Neuve Chapelle was around 1,000 metres distant from the British front line, and two more key features lay beyond. The Lays Brook, a wide, deep drainage ditch running through here, and the heavily wooded Bois de Biais leading up to the slight rise of the Aubers Ridge. Crisscrossing the battlefield were also thick hedges of hawthorn that provided natural obstacles which would have to be contended with by any attacker. Because the water table was so close to the surface of the ground here, both sides' defences would have been shallow trenches with breastworks of sandbags and material built up to 6 feet high, not dug down into the ground as we often imagine. Although barbed wire was in use by this time, in early 1915 it was nowhere near the insurmountable obstacle that would be seen later in the war. The short distances and relatively weak defences offered the British a glimmering hope of success. That task would fall to the British 4th Corps under the command of Lieutenant General Sir Henry Rawlinson and the Indian Corps commanded by Lieutenant General Sir James Wilcox. Both of their corps comprised 2 divisions, each with 3 brigades, and each of those had 4 or sometimes 5 battalions of about 1,000 men, although Indian battalions were slightly smaller with about 750 men. The Indian Corps took on the right flank of the attack. The Meerut Division would lead, with the Lahore Division in support. Their objective would be to break through the southern part of the village and towards the Bois de Biais and then beyond. British 4th Corps on the left flank comprised the 8th Division on the right and the 7th Division on their left. These were composed of regular battalions that had been recalled from manning garrisons across the Empire. The 8th would attack first and make for the village before pressing on towards the village of Piètre. The 7th were to punch out northeast to get to the north of Aubers, but only after the 8th Division had secured the orchard just here. This will be an important feature on the first day. In reserve to exploit any gains were the newly formed 46th North Midland Territorial Division, the Cavalry Corps and the Indian Cavalry Corps. The British had amassed over 300 artillery pieces for the attack, and this would be one of the most intense bombardments seen in the war to date. But ammunition supplies across the whole BEF were extremely limited, and so, whilst violent, the bombardment would be necessarily short. Opposing the British in this sector was the German 6th Army, commanded by Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria. Locally, the blow would fall on General Eberhard von Kleer's 7th Corps, but because the Germans had been diverting forces to the Eastern Front, on the 10th of March, his front line was only manned by 1.5 battalions with limited reserves at immediate readiness to come forward. However, there were probably over 30,000 German reserves that could reach Neuve Chapelle within 24 hours, meaning that for the British, time would be of the essence. So now we know the plan, it's worth remembering that a huge amount is going on in a short space of time in a very confined area, and so to understand what happens, we'll look at each sector in turn on consecutive days. At 7:30 am on Wednesday the 10th of March 1915, British artillery opened a hurricane bombardment 35 minutes before the infantry would go over the top. Shrapnel shells packed by lead balls were used to cut the barbed wire and, as steel helmets were yet to be issued, decimate any defenders in the open. Limited stocks of high explosive were also fired to smash the stronger German defences. The bombardment was a complete surprise to the Germans, as Major General Francis Davies recalled.
The artillery fire on the 10th of March was nothing less than devastating in its effects. That it was so is due to the skillful placing of the batteries by the artillery commander and to the patient and careful preparations made by the batteries themselves. It is to be noted that those preparations, including registration, were carried out without apparently arousing the suspicions of the enemy.
At 8:05, the artillery lifted its bombardment of the front line and moved on to Chapelle village. The troops of the Garwal Brigade of the Indian Corps on the right and the 23rd and 25th Brigades of the 8th Division on the left clambered over their breastworks and advanced in line. At 8:35, the artillery would lift again to the German rear areas. In essence, this was a very basic creeping barrage, so the troops had to move fast. Focusing first on the Indian Corps' advance, their aim was to link up with the 8th Division in Chapelle whilst also advancing across the open ground toward the WW1. The Garwal Rifles made for the village. But it was not all plain sailing, as Subadar Kedar Singh Rawat explained.
We reached the German trenches in less than 2 minutes. All that was left of us, that is. The enemy swept our ranks with machine gun and rifle fire, for we found that though the entanglements had been demolished, their fortifications were practically intact. Only 72 of us reached their parapets, and we lay close to the mounds seeking what protection we could. Our captain was wounded and then killed. But before he died, he ordered me to take command of the remnant of our double company, for the lieutenant had already met his death in wriggling from hole to hole in the parapet and shooting such Germans as came within his view.
Despite the success of the artillery barrage, the fighting was intense. Many German prisoners were taken after being demoralised by the shelling, but their machine guns further back towards the WW1 and retaliatory artillery fire took their toll on the Indian troops crossing the pan-flat terrain. During the attack, 21-year-old rifleman Gobar Singh Negi, charging into the main enemy trench and clearing traverse after traverse at the point of the bayonet, would posthumously earn the Victoria Cross. But near Port Arthur, the attack of the 1st 39th Garwal Rifles had gone seriously wrong. They'd lost direction and veered off too far south. This created a significant gap between them and the Leicesters, who were by 10 am trying to cross the Leys Brook whilst being enfiladed by surviving Germans in the unaffected trenches. There was initial success here, but by mid-morning that gap was creating serious delays. To their left, 8th Division attacked at the same time as the Indians. Let's have a closer look at the area that they attacked in. The plan was for the 25th Brigade to advance directly towards the village. The initial barrage was successful here, and the German trenches were captured within just 15 minutes. Advancing over the ground between the Rue de Moulin on the right and Signpost Lane on the left, this was a 2-battalion frontal attack by the 2nd Royal Berkshires and the 2nd Lincolns, who made remarkable progress through the German support trenches to allow the supporting units to leapfrog through them at 8:20 am. Such was the speed of the advance, they had to wait for the artillery to lift from the village at 8:35 before moving forward to take it around 9 am, thus linking up with the Garwal Rifles in the main street. An advance of around 1,000 metres inside an hour was very successful for the time. Rifleman Peters was there.
Then it was our turn. Taking things as coolly as you like, we raced over the ground, right through the Berkshires and into the village. The Germans were completely surprised, and those who were not killed were stupefied by the lyddite fumes, and were only too pleased to surrender.
Altogether, this was a textbook attack. The artillery had done its job and the infantry had met their first objectives. Whilst the 2nd Rifles cleared the village, a small reconnaissance party from the Worcesters, whose job it would be to press on from here, pushed forward towards Leys Brook and found no German opposition south of the village, which they reported at 9:30 am. A huge opportunity to quickly advance was going begging, but this would hinge on troops on their left successfully advancing at the same pace. We've now moved back to the jumping off point of the 23rd Brigade at 8:05 am. Their advance was between Signpost Lane on the right and the Orchard, from where they planned to press towards Mokissa and Pietre villages. Two things are important here. They must keep touch with the 25th Brigade on their right, and they must be able to take the Orchard before General Rawlinson would order the 7th Division to sweep around on their left past the moated Grange to roll up the front line from the flank. Again, this was a 2-battalion frontal attack with the 2nd Scottish Rifles on the right and the 2nd Middlesex on the left. But the big problem here was that some of the artillery in this sector had arrived late and not been able to register its guns to provide accurate fire on the attacking front. The result was devastating. 2 companies of the German 11th Jaeger Battalion were unaffected by the barrage and thus able to lay down a murderous volume of fire. Only a few men reached the wire, which was still intact, and very heavy casualties were sustained by the Scottish Rifles, including their commanding officer, who was killed trying to reorganise the chaos. The advance had stalled, leaving the 25th Brigade with an open flank, which would undermine further advances towards the Aubers Ridge. On their left, the Middlesex fared no better. They were held up by strong German resistance and Maxim machine gun bullets tearing across the open ground at a rate of 600 rounds per minute halted the advancing troops in their tracks. Importantly, this meant they failed to capture the strong point in the Orchard, which needed to be reported clear before the 7th Division could advance on the left of the line. By 10 am, British gains looked like this. But due to the gaps in the line on both corps front, progress was starting to fall behind schedule. Neuve Chapelle had been secured, but communications back to the commanders from the front were slow and confusing. General Haig even requested that the cavalry be prepared to move forward to exploit the gains at 9 am, but he was unaware that the attack was losing momentum. The gaps needed to be filled, and particularly the Orchard had to be taken to secure the left flank in the north and bring the strength of the 7th Division to bear. The clock was now ticking faster than the British would have liked. Although the Germans only had limited reinforcements in the immediate area, they started to consolidate several machine gun strongholds in these locations. They would command the battlefield over the next few days. Jumping back to the south now, at 9 am, the Dira-Dun Brigade was ordered forward from their concentration area 3 kilometres behind the British lines to attack towards the Bois de Billet and help relieve the Garwal Rifles, who were still isolated south of Port Arthur. It would take them time to get there, allowing the Germans to reinforce further. This is where the plan really started to unravel in the Indian Corps area. It was taking time for reports to get back to headquarters and for new orders to be sent out. Major General Anderson, commanding the Meerut Division, decided that another artillery barrage on the gap in the line would be needed before the advance could be restarted. Gurkhas of the Dira-Dun Brigade, supported by British troops and parts of the Lahore Division, would lead that advance to secure the gap in their sector. They finally did so at 5 am and continued with a gallant frontal attack towards the Bois de Billet. It was now getting dark. After crossing the Lays Brook with difficulty, the Gurkhas made it to the edge of the wood with some casualties. At 6:30 pm they dug in, but scouts went ahead and found the wood empty of Germans. However, there was no way that they could continue the advance unsupported at night. Finding themselves isolated, they fell back to the Lays Brook. German reinforcements now entered the wood unopposed. The opportunity had been lost. So why were the 8th Division not there? Returning to the north, we see that they too were suffering with slow communications. Winding the clock back again to 10 am, there were 2 critical imperatives. Firstly, for the 23rd Brigade to secure the Orchard, which would allow the 7th Division to come into play, and secondly, to get the 24th Brigade into action to force a path between the other 2 brigades. Major General Davies, commanding, ordered a new bombardment at 10 am on the untouched German frontline positions, which allowed a small advance. A further bombardment took place at 11:15 and was more effective, allowing remnants of several battalions to seize the German trenches and to advance to the Orchard and Moated Grange. But this news did not reach General Rawlinson until 1:15. Therefore, the 7th Division was still not ordered to advance. Instead of advancing further, the 24th Brigade was now busy trying to fill the gap between the 23rd and the 25th. But with units scattered all around, it took time. It was not until 1:30 that he was able to gather his brigade together to take up the attack. General Rawlinson's plan was now to push forward on the whole front at 3:30 PM. Due to confused orders, the 7th Division made a false start at 2:15, but eventually reassembled to attack at the correct time in an assault towards the quadrilateral with the 8th Division on their right. But ironically, the 8th Division were late, meaning that they did not advance until 5:30, taking massive casualties in the reinforced German redoubts before digging in short of the new German line at nightfall. This is when the Gurkhas were crossing the Leys Brook to the south and moving towards the Bois de Billet. The dominoes had fallen. None of the attacking troops had assaulted together, and uncoordinated attacks had resulted in heavy casualties across this ground. Despite heroic efforts of the 7th Division, they too ended up short of the quadrilateral with an open right flank and were forced to dig in. By the end of the day, the Germans had now managed to get 4 battalions into the new front line, stiffen the strong points and form loose interconnective defensive positions which had not been registered as targets for the British artillery. The British plan for the opening day had faltered, and despite some successes, the Germans held on and crucially were able to reinforce overnight. The second day of the battle, 11th of March, saw a repeat of the confusion and mistakes of the first. At 6:45 AM, the British fired another limited barrage, dwindling shell supplies now although were becoming a real worry. This was followed at 7 AM by a general advance across the whole front by 4th Corps and the Indian Corps towards the same objectives. The Germans were now well prepared, and most of these attacks were stopped very quickly under extremely heavy German artillery and machine gun fire. Throughout the day, a further series of ineffectual and uncoordinated barrages were followed by infantry attacks, all doomed to failure. The only limited success was achieved by the 8th Division here at the Duck's Bill. Even in this case, confusion reigned, and after 3 charges, only this small group of houses could be captured. The offensive had most definitely stalled. But it would be the Germans who would make the next move, as General von Kleer now had sufficient reinforcements to mount the inevitable counterattack. At nightfall on the second day, British and Indian troops were also getting tired and hungry in the front line. It was just as difficult to get food to the units as it was to pass orders, and they would have to fight hard defensively the next day. The British plan for the 12th of March was to attack again at 10:30 AM using a similar plan as the previous days. But, and this is a big but, by now, unobserved, the Germans had massed around 16,000 troops for a counterattack. At 5 AM, attempting a frontal assault in 4 main thrusts, the Germans launched that attack, but faced exactly the same commander control difficulties as the British had on the previous 2 days. Advancing in the darkness, with poor visibility, their attack was uncoordinated, and their artillery barrage was badly ranged, failing to suppress the new British front line. The tables were turned. The British now controlled the open ground, and within an hour, the German counterattack was repulsed, having suffered huge casualties. One final valiant attempt was made to regain the Allied initiative in the Indian Corps sector that afternoon, when the Sirhind and Jullundar brigades advanced. Despite incredible courage, they too would fail, losing hundreds of men in just a few minutes over this unassuming patch of ground. The only notable successes of the day were delivered by the 7th Division in the north. After an effective bombardment at noon, they had left their sheltered position in no man's land and crept forward to rush the quadrilateral against little resistance, taking 400 demoralised prisoners, with Lance Corporal Wilfred Fuller and Private Edward Barber both earning the Victoria Cross. But it was too little, too late, and at midnight, with no further prospect of success, all further attacks were called off. The Battle of Neuve Chapelle was over. So what was the result of the battle? On one level, very little ground had been taken, and at huge cost. But these attacks did highlight several major problems which would eventually be addressed. First, communications were both essential but also extremely problematic. Second, a chronic lack of artillery shells meant follow-up attacks became progressively harder. And third, keeping reserves held too far back meant that any gains could not be exploited. But we shouldn't forget the Germans were learning too. As a result of this battle, it became clear that defence in depth was the key to holding the Allies at bay, something the British would discover in the months to come across this very same ground as the fighting on the Western Front continued. Once the dust had settled, both sides had time to assess their losses. All told, the British had suffered some 12,000 casualties, including 4,200 men of the Indian Corps. The Germans likewise had been badly hit, with casualty estimates ranging from 8,500 to 12,000 men killed, wounded and missing. Today there are few visible remains of the battlefield of Neuve Chapelle, but given their tremendous sacrifice and fighting spirit here, it's a fitting place for this, the Neuve Chapelle Indian Memorial. Located directly on the site of Port Arthur, in the heart of the battlefield, the monument, complete with battle scars from the British retreat to Dunkirk in 1940, today commemorates over 4,700 soldiers and labourers who lost their lives on the Western Front and who have no known grave. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, why not check out our other content right here on YouTube. And of course, a huge thank you to Great War Digital's Linesman for sponsoring this video. Be sure to check out their trench mapping products with the link in the description. And if, like us, you find the First World War endlessly fascinating, be sure to check out our podcast, Not So Quiet on the Western Front, where each week Dr. Spencer Jones and I explore many of the fascinating episodes of the First World War. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.